Some tomato failures do not begin with disease. They begin with the wrong plant sitting just inches away. And one of the worst companions on this list looks so soft, so harmless, that most gardeners never suspect it until the season feels smaller than it should. Today, I'm ranking the worst and best tomato companions, from the true troublemakers all the way up to the combinations I would trust in a small garden year after year. Because when a bed is small, the season is short, and every harvest matters, the wrong neighbor does more than waste space. It quietly steals strength, airflow, moisture, and sometimes even the harvest you were counting on. And here is the surprising part. One of the most famous tomato companions in the world still does not take the top spot in this ranking. While working through these pairings for veggie matchmakers, that pattern became impossible to ignore. The plants people feel safest planting near tomatoes are not always the ones that make life easier or make the bed more productive. So let's start at the very bottom first, with the companions that can quietly ruin a tomato season before most people even realize what went wrong. There are few things more discouraging than walking out on a warm summer morning, seeing your tomato plants from a distance and thinking they look fine, only to step closer and realize they are crowded, tired, shaded, or simply not thriving the way they should. At this stage of life, most of us are not gardening because we want more confusion. We are gardening because we want something steadier than that. We want fresh food, less waste, a little more beauty, a little more confidence. And if possible, a setup that doesn't ask us to bend, guess, and start over all season long. That is why companion planting matters. Not as a miracle, not as folklore, and not as a magic trick. A good companion planting setup simply makes the bed work better. It can make better use of space, it can help with airflow, it can make watering and harvesting easier, it can bring in beneficial insects, and in some cases, it can lower the kind of stress that causes a season to go downhill quietly. Here at Family Yard Kitchen, that's what I care about most. Not clever garden myths, real pairings that work for families, small spaces, raised beds, and repeatable routines. And one more note before we begin. If you keep backyard chickens, just keep this in the back of your mind as we go. Let manure age properly. Use fully finished compost when you can. Keep fresh manure out of the bed that is giving you today's tomatoes and salad greens, and wash your hands well after coop work. A productive yard is a blessing, but a clean garden, coop, kitchen loop matters just as much. Now let's get into the ranking. These are the neighbors I would not trust in the same tomato bed if your goal is a clean, simple, low-drama season. These are not small inconveniences. These are the pairings that can increase risk, increase competition, or make tomato growing harder than it needs to be. If I had to start at the bottom, I would start here. Potatoes and tomatoes may seem like they belong together because they are both familiar, both useful, and both feel at home in a practical family garden, but that is exactly why they can trick people. They're close relatives, and that means they can share some of the same serious disease problems. So when you plant them side by side, you're not making a smart little family reunion. You're making it easier for trouble to move across the bed. This is one of those mistakes that can cost more than space. It can cost peace of mind. If your tomatoes matter to you, give potatoes their own section, or better yet, a separate bed and a proper rotation. This means cabbage, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, and their close cousins. Now, I'm not saying these are bad crops, they're wonderful crops. But right up against tomatoes in a small raised bed, they can become demanding neighbors. They're heavy feeders, they want space, they often want a different rhythm of care. And before long, your tomato bed can start feeling like two strong personalities competing for the same room. For a younger gardener with plenty of room and plenty of energy, maybe that complication feels manageable. But for a small space garden or a simpler seasonal routine, this pairing often creates more strain than reward. And here is that quiet plant I warned you about. Fennel looks gentle, feathery, almost elegant. It doesn't look like the kind of plant that would sabotage anything, but this is one of the companions I trust the least near tomatoes. If there's one plant on this list that creates genuine curiosity because it surprises people, it's fennel. Gardeners see something soft and harmless. Meanwhile, underground, it can interfere with the growth of nearby vegetables, and that's what makes it such a strange kind of mistake. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It just leaves you wondering why the bed never seemed to perform the way you hoped. If you love fennel, that's fine. Just treat it like a plant that deserves its own space, not your tomato bed. Before we leave this lowest tier, I want to add one fast warning. If tall corn is planted too close and begins to shade your tomatoes, or if your tomatoes are growing anywhere near a black walnut problem area, that's not a small detail. Tomatoes need light, warmth, and room to dry out after dew or rain. Too much shade can quietly rob the plant of energy and make disease pressure worse. So the lesson of Tier 1 is simple. Don't force bad neighbors to stay together just because the bed looks full. A full bed is not always a productive bed. And the next tier is frustrating in a different way. These plants usually don't ruin the season, they just make it fussier. If you enjoy this kind of clear, visual garden breakdown, you're welcome to subscribe. There's a lot more in this tomato series, and I'd be glad to have you here. These are the plants that can live nearby with care, but they are not the easiest. And for many gardeners, especially in small beds, not the easiest is enough reason to rethink the plan. This includes things like sweet corn nearby, or large squash vines trying to share the same precious area. Can they exist in the general garden? Yes. Can they make a tomato bed feel crowded, thirsty, and harder to manage? Also yes. There's a kind of garden stress that doesn't come from one terrible mistake. It comes from too many demanding plants pulling from the same pocket of soil at the same time. That's what happens here. Tomatoes are already asking for sun, nutrients, support, and airflow. If you place equally hungry or sprawling plants too close, you can create a bed that always feels one step behind. This one is more about season than blame. Peas can be lovely early on. Some beans can be perfectly fine nearby. But if they stay too long or if the timing is off, the tomato bed can lose its balance. The mistake here is not planting them at all. The mistake is treating early season companions like they can stay forever, even after the tomatoes begin to take command of summer. There's wisdom in letting one crop hand the bed over to another. That's different from forcing them to compete all season long. Dill is interesting because in the right place, its flowers can be useful, but right up against tomato stems, it can become one more thing crowding the picture. And the same goes for strong herbs like mint or even oregano if you let it roam too freely in a tight space. This is why I call them so-so roommates, not because they're evil, not because they're useless, but because they can turn a clean, easy care bed into a bed that always feels slightly overgrown, slightly tangled, slightly harder to read. And when a garden becomes harder to read, it becomes harder to care for. One quick chicken note here. If you're feeding a small tomato bed with manure-based compost, keep the timing thoughtful. Mature compost is one thing, fresh manure is another. Good gardening is not only about what grows well, it's also about what stays safe for the kitchen. Now we move into the part of the ranking that begins to feel better. Because the next companions don't just avoid trouble, they start giving something back. This is where the bed begins to feel generous. These are the companions that make practical sense. They fit, they behave, they are easy to explain. And most importantly, they make a tomato bed feel useful without making it feel crowded. Lettuce, spinach, a few simple greens. This is one of the most comforting combinations in a small garden, because it makes the bed feel productive early and then graceful later. In the beginning of the season, those greens give you something to pick while the tomatoes are still thinking. And later, as the tomato plants grow taller, that bit of shade can actually help tender greens hold on longer. There is something deeply satisfying about walking out to one bed and bringing back both tomatoes and salad from the same space. Not because it is trendy, because it is sensible. Carrots are one of those quiet partners that do not demand attention. They sit lower. They use the space differently. They do not create visual chaos. And for many gardeners, that matters more than people realize. A good tomato bed should not feel like a puzzle every time you approach it. You should be able to see what is happening, reach what you need, and understand the layout from a few steps away. Carrots help with that. They are humble. But humble companions are often the ones that age best in a real garden. This includes onions, chives, leeks, and other alliums around the edges. This may be one of my favorite visual ideas in the whole ranking, because it is so simple. Put your tomatoes in the central space, and around the border, give them an onion fence. That edge becomes useful, readable, easy to reach, easy to harvest. And for older gardeners especially, that kind of layout matters. You aren't reaching through a jungle every time you want one thing. You're moving through a bed that makes sense. I also like this pairing because it feels orderly without feeling stiff. It gives the garden shape. And if you want one small supporting note here, compact bush beans can sometimes fit into the helpful category better than tangled pole beans, simply because they keep the bed calmer and easier to maintain. These are good neighbors, but helpful is not the same as protective, because the next tier is where the garden starts doing more than coexisting. It starts supporting the tomatoes in visible ways. Now we're getting into the companions people tend to remember. These are the plants that make a tomato bed feel intentional, not just planted, designed. Basil earns its reputation. It is compact, useful in the kitchen, beautiful near tomatoes, and it belongs in this upper tier for good reason. There is a reason so many people instinctively pair basil with tomatoes. It looks right, it feels right, and in a small bed, it often works right. But I want to say something important here. Reputation alone does not win this ranking. Basil is excellent. Still, a single famous companion is not always the same thing as the best overall layout. And that matters because a lot of gardeners stop at basil and think they've solved everything. They haven't. They have made a strong start. I'm grouping these together because this is where the bed starts feeling protected. Marigolds bring color, but they do more than that. They help the bed feel alive. They draw the eye. And over time, they can become part of a tomato layout that feels both practical and cheerful. Then there's thyme. Low, fragrant, tidy. Thyme is the kind of plant that doesn't shout for attention, but it can make the whole bed feel more finished. Around the base of tomatoes, low aromatic herbs can help the soil stay shaded, reduce that bare, exposed look, and make the planting feel calmer and more complete. And then, just beyond the bed, a small flower strip or even one small pot of flowers like calendula, alyssum, or dill in the right place can make the whole system feel stronger. This is the point in the ranking where the garden stops feeling like a fight and starts feeling like a plan. So now we come to the top. Not just good companions, not just bodyguards, the combinations worth repeating every year. If these simple bed ideas are helping you see your tomato garden more clearly, you're welcome to subscribe and join me here. Small practical ideas really do add up over time. This final tier is not about one single magic plant. It's about combinations. Combinations that are easy to understand, easy to repeat, and good enough to keep in your back pocket every tomato season. This is the quiet beauty layout. If you like a garden that feels calm, soft, and thoughtfully arranged, this one is lovely. You have the tomatoes as the main structure, thyme keeping things low and neat around the base, and then nearby, one simple flower strip or one small pot that invites beneficial insects into the area. This layout does not feel crowded, it feels composed. For the gardener who wants the bed to look peaceful from the porch and still make practical sense up close, this is an excellent choice. This one is wonderfully orderly. It's the layout I would recommend to someone who likes clean borders, clear harvest zones, and a bed that makes sense at a glance. Tomatoes in the center, alliums around the edge, carrots tucked into the lower spaces. It feels almost like common sense made visible, and there is something comforting about that.
No extra drama, no guessing, just a bed that uses space well and keeps the harvesting simple. For many older gardeners, this may actually be the easiest layout to live with over a whole season. But there is still one combination I would place above it. This is the winner. Not because it is the most complicated, because it is not. Not because it promises miracles, because it does not. It wins because it combines beauty, usefulness, familiarity, and small space practicality better than anything else on this list. You have tomatoes as the main crop, basil as that trusted, classic companion, marigolds bringing color and support around the bed, and lettuce filling the early space before the tomatoes fully take over. This is the kind of combination that feels generous to a family. It gives you something early, something later, something beautiful in between. And it's easy to understand even if you're looking at the bed from 10 feet away. That matters, especially for a senior-friendly garden, because the best layout is not only the one that can work on paper, it's the one that feels encouraging in real life. A bed like this says quietly, yes, I can do this again. And that, to me, is what a dream team should be. So if you remember nothing else from today, remember this. Tomatoes don't need a crowded bed. They need the right company. Avoid the true troublemakers. Be careful with the merely fussy ones. Keep the helpful neighbors close. Use the bodyguards wisely. And when you can, build one of those dream team layouts you can repeat without overthinking it. That's how a garden becomes more dependable, not through complicated charts, but through a few clear choices made well. If companion planting is something you want laid out in a calm, visual, practical way, that's exactly why I made Veggie Matchmakers. I wanted it to be simple enough to use right in the garden, especially for small beds, patios, and beginner spaces, without having to second-guess every pairing. So if you'd like a guide you can keep beside you while you plan and plant, that book was made for that. And if this ranking helped you think more clearly about your tomato bed, watch the next video on your screen, 14 Forgotten Vegetables for a Survival Garden, lazy gardener friendly. Because once you know the right companions, the next step is choosing crops that keep giving, even when energy, weather, and timing are not perfect. Thank you for spending this time with me.